Sandra. Can you tell me, did you immigrate to the United States? And if you did, when did you?
Sure. I did immigrate to the U.S. With my mother when I was 9 years old. My mother came here first, and then within 3 months she picked me up from Lima. And it was supposed to be primarily just a visiting trip. It wasn't supposed to be something permanent. But I've always been very close to my mom, and so when the time came where she was asking me if I wanted to be sent back, there was this really strong feeling that, no, I actually want to stay with you. So that was actually the first time that we ever discussed it, and we talked about it. And it's kind of a weird decision to make at 9 years old, but I just decided that I wanted to be here with her.
Okay. So what is your stance on immigration, and more specifically on undocumented immigration? Also your stance on immigration reform debate that's currently going on.
Well, I'm obviously pro-immigration reform. I think currently the question is, what will comprehensive immigration reform look like? I think at this point in time, we've finally begun to recognize that this isn't a question of if we're going to ever have immigration reform, it's a matter of when. Whether the bill comprehensively addresses all of the issues that that are happening in immigration, I'm not really sure. I think I have very mixed feelings. In a sense, I do have this desire to begin to see something get passed, something, where we can begin to see some kind of change happen. At the same time, I'm cognizant of the fact that this bill does leave out several people. Just the other day, I was actually having a conversation with a friend who focuses on immigration reform, but for the Black Caucus. And just this idea of we're getting away with the diversity visa. And how does that actually affect other communities outside of the Latino community? How does that actually affect the African diaspora, especially in the Caribbean? And the fact is that some of the communities that have most benefited from the diversity visa actually come from the Caribbean. So this idea of, well, how does changing immigration reform, how does taking away this visa suddenly change and impact who would be able to come into this country? And it's brought up a lot of questions for me about, well, are we actively engaging in a way that we're understanding who already comes into this country, and actually amplifying that, ensuring that other people, a more diverse group of people, are able to come to the U.S. and have the same opportunity, or are we actively providing opportunity for some and deceptively actually taking it away from others? So I think for me, questions that will come up for immigration reform in the next several weeks will be this idea of, well, we all belong to different communities and we have different interests for those communities in ensuring that they're safe and that they can come to this country and hopefully get a pathway to citizenship. But along that line, will we also extend across to other communities and understand that it isn't just a Latino issue, it's a big issue for several communities around the world, from people coming from Africa, from Asia, from all parts of the world, really.
Okay. Okay, so the next question is, you probably know that over the years there's been a change in the political climate, right? And it has led to significant changes in immigration law, and the public attitude about immigration has changed as well. For example, immigrants were able to process their citizenship much faster with the amnesty of 1986 or the Braceros program. However, after circumstances such as 9/11, immigration law and public opinion changed dramatically in a much more negative way. Have you noticed this shift in attitude, and if so, what has been your personal experience with immigration?
Sure. I think the time lags are something that most people that went through the immigration process in the last decade noticed. If anything, because lawyers made you very aware of it. If you were lucky enough to have a lawyer, as in my case, then the lawyer was very cognizant of what the timelines were, how long it might take you to have paperwork filed. But what we don't tend to talk about in terms of what 9/11 did is it created a whole different system in terms of how we dealt with immigration. It created entire new offices, and it caused actually some offices to move to other places. So files were lost, and people were left behind not knowing what their status was or what happened to their files. I think that was also brought in part because of the pressures of the American public to try and have more screening, more examinations take place before giving any kind of documentation. So from a very personal perspective, I definitely felt it. I mean, I was separated from my own family for about 6 years. The only person that I had contact with here was my mother. But otherwise, I could not go back to Peru. I could not see my father or my grandparents. And that really affects the way in which you grow up and the way in which you see family and community. And it even shapes your own identity and how you see that. So growing up and having that experience was very formative. I think the only other thing that I can think of, I grew up in Prince William County, and in case people don't know, Prince William County passed a law back in 2007 that actually merged immigration with police services. And so essentially it was the grandfather law to what would later become SB 1070. And at the time, I was actually working with county government as a youth advisor. So did I feel some of the onslaught and see some of the ways in which the American community began to see, and maybe not be as welcoming as I thought, of the Latino community and any other immigrant community? I definitely saw that. And it was such a weird experience to be working with county government, to have people that had known me for X number of years, and not know that as I was working with them, I was also part of the immigration system, and I was part of this immigration battle, and that the laws that they were making would actively affect me and my families, even though they were so willing to work with me on an everyday basis. So it was definitely interesting to see this idea of, as a student, as a community member, having always felt very close to my community. I mean, there were people that knew my mother was a single parent and would actively go to my school if I was sick because she couldn't make it out of work. And that kind of changes the idea of who looks like a good immigrant, who do you consider someone worthy of staying in your community, and who do you want to exclude? And those are questions that I always think about, because the fact that I ended up being on this idea of what a good immigrant looks like is completely randomized. It's not something that I get to choose for myself. It's someone that chooses for me, somebody that looks at me and says, well, this is the identity that I perceive and that I will put upon you. And so in that term, it's a big question about privilege, the fact that I'm documented and I'm able to now do all sorts of different things, but there's also this idea of acceptance, and the fact that I have enjoyed some level of acceptance because there have been members of the American community that have said, I want to extend that to you. Have I seen that across to other communities? No, I think we've seen the rise of Islamophobia in the last several years, and it doesn't seem to be abating anytime soon. These are real questions that we should have because they have real life implications.
Okay, sounds good. Can you tell me how the immigration process to obtain citizenship works?
Sure. So in my case, I came to the U.S. and I actually came with a visa. So I was one of the immigrants, as we all know, that overstayed their visa. And it was a very strategic and tactical move where I had the support of a lawyer who knew every step of the process. So as soon as we knew that I was going to overstay my visa, we began working through the immigration system and seeing what options were available to me. So surprisingly enough, at 13 years old, I actually was able to get a worker's permit. And that's how my mother would pay taxes for me. Because there was an understanding that if I ever wanted to get citizenship, there is a backlog and I would have to pay some of those taxes. But who can afford to pay back like 10 years worth of taxes? So had a worker's permit that I couldn't actually use for several years just to have a social security number, and then ended up getting my U.S. residency in around 2005. And then waited around 3-5 years before I was able to apply for U.S. citizenship. And at the time, it actually intersected with my time studying abroad. So it really reshaped the experience because I had a lawyer with me telling me, well, you can't be away for an entire year. You have to come back every 6 months. But that meant I was actually coming back every 2 months. So I had quite a few high expenses when it came to travel for that year. But I was very knowledgeable of the fact that if you're outside of the country, you can't actually apply for citizenship, because if you get called, then it looks really bad if you're not in the country. But I think it also points to the fact of how the system works. Sometimes you know that the timeline is speeding up, so you know when to apply. So sometimes it's actually good to wait, because if the timeline is really backlogged, then you're going to be waiting in the line forever, as opposed to those moments when it really picks up and it's actually in your favor to do it. So even though during my residency process, it actually took them 2 years to do a background check because I didn't have a background in Lima, I had been a child, when it came to doing my U.S. citizenship, it only took about 3 months. So it was a very, very speedy process.
Okay. Finally, how do you think that status, whether it's undocumented, documented, or whatever it is, how do you think that that affects people's everyday lives?
I mean, I think something that I tend to think about is there is the most obvious effects of being undocumented and the struggles that you have to go through, from not being able sometimes to acquire a driver's license, all the way to sometimes having to pay out-of-state tuition for in-state, even though you've been in the state for a really long time for your education. So the opportunities that you're able to have, what you can afford, where you can go, it closes up a lot of educational and employment opportunities. But beyond that, I think there's just something that we don't tend to talk about enough, which is documents and the visa itself does not grant you acceptance within the community at large. So receiving your paperwork, getting citizenship does not suddenly imply that I am seen as American by every single member of the American community. In a way, even if you didn't cross the border, because of the stigmas that do exist in American society, you're eternally dragging this border with you, because people just assume, or they think, they have these stereotypes and these ideas of what immigrants have experienced and what they live through. And I think that just shapes your everyday life, because it just shapes your daily interactions, and that's what we create as a community. Society are built on these daily interactions, so if you have someone that has already made up all these preconceived notions about you and your experiences in your life, do they really want to get to know you? And if they don't really want to get to know you, are they going to accept you and truly incorporate you into what they deem, their chosen family or their friendships or their employment spaces? I think not questioning those aspects of the immigrant identity, the fact that we always feel like we have to work harder, that we're never actually quite American yet. This construct is important because it's keeping us from really questioning, well, what does being American mean? And when do we become American?
It's really good. All right, Sandra, that's all we have for you. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem.